Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about designing enemies for video games, and it's part of a larger suite of videos that I am making about game design in general. And in this one, I'm going to present some design thoughts. I often do this in these series of videos. Some of these things are things that have been mentioned earlier in this series of videos. But I particularly like to focus in on what are the questions or parameters that a designer needs to think about in order to pretty much in order to think about getting quality in terms of their game design. So with enemies, I think the most important aspect is variety, and have talked about that in the previous videos quite a bit. I think when you're thinking about variety, you need to think about how it impacts the player and the player experience. So there are obviously several ways in which you can make variations in your enemies that your player's going to face. The basic two in terms of how they fight are varying the stats and varying the tactics that they use. And the next video after this one, we'll be talking about enemy AI. When you're making a set of enemies, obviously you want to make it consistent with your world building. Uh, you don't probably want a serious, dark uh, game that is set in hell to suddenly have animated teddy bears attacking you, unless they're particularly creepy teddy bears. But as well as going along with the consistency of your world, you do need to always think about how the player is impacted and the needs of the game as well as the needs of the world. And the fundamental question is, how many enemies are you going to need in your game? How many different types of enemies, really, this means? I guess you could have quite a small game and you might not need very many enemy types. You could have a large game and you need many enemy types. As with many design decisions, this depends on the nature of your game and the genre of your game. RPGs often have a large variety of enemies. First-person shooters usually less so. But I would say that as I see game design documents coming from students who are studying on my modules, that one of my most common criticisms in terms of enemies is that they've only produced 3 different enemy types and not thought about how to get a bigger variety in there as part of the player experience. So you don't need to overwhelm the player with different varieties, but you do need to suit your game, and um, yeah, and you need to have a decent spread of enemies, so there is that variety that they face. So here's just a screenshot of some variety in enemies. There we go. So the next question I'm throwing at you is, what information do the devs need? And there's an earlier video in this series that actually breaks that down. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to quickly flash up the template that I showed in that video. And part of this was thinking about what is it that when you've designed a game, or when you're in the process of designing and creating a game, what do the people who are actually doing the development need to know about your enemies? So refer back to that video. Okay. In games, I'm going to read this out. In games, you get to do things you can't do in real life. And it's one of the huge, powerful things about video games is that they're an escape and a fantasy. And you get to do all sorts. So this gives you, as a game designer, opportunities. And if you want the player to feel empowered, you can get them to face particular types of enemies. There's a quite a well-known book called Killing Monsters, I can't remember who it's by, which argues that violence in games isn't necessarily a bad thing for children if it allows them to face their fears and to feel empowered in facing the monster under the bed, or whatever it is that they're scared of. So as designers, there's an opportunity here not only to use the hooks that people have, uh, where they've got particular either fears or antagonisms or things that they might want to be able to take out in a fantasy setting rather than in the real world. Um, but also, there's a potential therapeutic effect here as well in terms of helping people deal with things that have bothered them. Um, so, throwing in things that people are scared of, spiders, and then potentially things that kinds of people who might be annoying. I feel like I have to put a caveat in here that you maybe have to be careful how you handle some of these, because along with the empowering, what you don't want to do is to try and make people feel that actually levying violence at other people in real life is a justified way of dealing with their problems. Sarcastic school teachers, and I hope it's not too much of a spoiler to say that one of my most favourite antagonists in any setting has been Dolores Umbridge in the Harry Potter series, um, because she's just so annoying and so unfair. Um, Bullies, yeah, it's nice to get your own back on the bullies. Annoying siblings, we're getting into some dangerous territory here potentially, but the annoying little brother or the bossy older sister. And the next one I want to do really quite carefully. I don't want to approach this in any jokey kind of way because we are into quite a dark area here when we talk about abusers, and the potential for using video games to deal with actual traumatic events that people have had in their past, and allow them to come to terms with these things and maybe to get a feeling of control over things that have happened in their past. There is a potential there, but I think if you are thinking of going down this route, you should definitely get some advice. Certainly, if you're going to have a game that is going to be released, as I say, I think that there's potential for huge benefits in these sorts of areas, but I think that it would have to be handled really carefully. Okay, moving on. Uh, yeah, so I'm going to read out what's on the screen again. Be careful about prejudice and stereotypes. So, over the years, in film and in books as well, and in games, the nature of the enemies has changed. And I remember growing up when it was quite common for enemies to be Nazis, and World War II was still on people's minds somewhat. And then there was a fad for it being drug dealers who are enemies. There has been terrorists as enemies, but you have to be careful about how you cast your enemies and how you deal with potential prejudice and stereotypes in there, and not just out and out saying, right, we're going to have our enemies are going to be the let's pick somebody at random, the Swiss, and all Swiss are obviously obsessed by cuckoo clocks and cheese and or whatever negative stereotypes. I'm not sure of that negative stereotypes, but whatever stereotype you might have, and you end up in the situation potentially where you're perpetuating stereotypes. This is particularly important when you're dealing with enemies because enemies obviously your concept in the game is that these people are nasty or they need to be defeated. Uh, and so the question of who are you fighting and why is an important one in games. And I think there's a lot of debate about violence in games and the potential effect of violent games on people who play the games. And most of that debate seems to completely miss this question, which is that it's not just about the violence, it's about why are you fighting and who are the targets of your violence. Um, and there have been studies I cannot reference them, but there have been studies that have shown that if you're in a defending role in video games, then this potentially has a different effect from if you're the aggressor in video games. Um, anyway, it's part and parcel of the whole idea that game designers have a responsibility to the players because they have a strong influence over the players in all sorts of ways. And being able to do something positive in terms of societal effect is something that I think potentially a lot of game designers don't really think about. Okay, so having preached at you a little bit, I'm going to say that's it from me for now.